The book of James says that as Christians, we are to be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Contrast that with the growing trend in America today that is quite disturbing. People are using angry outbursts to voice their frustrations and disagreements. Today on Weekend Connection, we'll take a look at why and whether we as Christians are being influenced. I'm Vic Gregory, and let's get connected. Welcome to our broadcast. In January 2016, a Time magazine article cited an Esquire NBC survey that found that of the 3,000 Americans queried, about half agreed that they were angrier than they were a year ago. Now, we may not feel that 3,000 out of 300 million is a significant sampling. However, instances of demonstrations of rage would suggest that there is an increase in public outbursts of anger in America. Today on Weekend Connection, we'll take a look at whether the premise is true, and if so, what that means to Christians living in such a society. Joining me today is Dr. Phil Davignon, and he earned his master's and doctorate degrees in sociology from Baylor University and is currently an assistant professor of sociology at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Most importantly, he is a follower of Jesus Christ. And Dr. Davignon, thank you for joining us today.
It's good to be on today. Thank you.
We're glad to have you. Would you agree that the instances of rage and public demonstrations of anger are on the increase in America today?
Certainly. I think we're seeing a lot more examples of this today. I think we even see it coming from the top. So, of course, we see it from people in strange outbursts, but we're also seeing it from the politicians who are supposed to be leading our country. Both politicians who are Democratic and Republican are using inflammatory language and demonizing the other side in order to gain votes.
That's exactly true. Dr. Davignon, are you familiar with the Whig interpretation of history?
Yes, I am.
Well, could you explain for us what that is and how it might contribute to this phenomenon that we're seeing today?
Sure. Well, this is basically a view of history that we are constantly progressing toward a better society. And I think in some ways we are. I think that people can see that perhaps technologically or in other ways, but in other ways it seems like we are regressing. And so there seem to be two things going on here. And there's really two visions in America today. I think that there are people who are progressive who see it as we are truly in social and moral ways becoming a better society. Then there are certain people who are conservative who say, no, we're actually regressing. We need to get back in touch with what our country was founded on.
Well, the Time article that I referred to earlier stated that most Americans believe some version of that Whig interpretation, and I guess we would call it the American dream. And the article went on to postulate the idea that when people recognize that institutions are standing in the way of them being able to secure their American dream or society moving forward and getting better and better, that they tend to get angry. And that's some of what we are seeing today. What would you say would be the response of someone who believed that the institutions of society were blocking his or her pursuit of personal enlightenment and prosperity?
Well, I think a lot of people, in fact, almost everyone feels threatened, I think. I think that conservatives feel threatened by progressives when it comes to moral issues. I think that progressives feel threatened by conservatives when it comes to other issues. And so I think almost everything that comes up becomes a battle and a fight, and there's one side that's trying to win, and whoever wins, the other side feels threatened and marginalized. And this is not good for the overall unity of our country.
Another Time magazine article I read suggested that the voter outrage that was communicated and successfully aided in electing former President Trump has led to an attitude that expressions of rage are acceptable. And consequently, we see anger being applauded and used to express concern for just about any issue. And the article stated some rather outlandish examples, like vegans who are outraged over the owners of a chain of plant-based restaurants who have taken to eating meat on their own farm and their own time. There's dancers who are outraged about a clothing ad in which a performer who portrays a dancer isn't really a dancer. This person is an actor. And then there's gardeners outraged and fishermen outraged and even knitters outraged. What does that say about our Judeo-Christian values in America when anger is seen as an acceptable form of expression?
Well, I think it's important for all of us to look at what is the glue that holds society together today. And I think for every culture, what holds a society together is what we worship. What does a country worship? And in the past, not everyone had the same view of God, but most people believed in some sort of truth and some sort of higher power, and that was the glue that held society together. But in today's world, it seems like that glue is becoming increasingly weak, and people can't exactly agree upon what the future of our country should be or what it is that even holds us together. And so our country is becoming quite fragmented, and I think that it's leading to a lot of outrage and anger in ways that is really quite scary, actually.
We're talking with Dr. Phil Davignon. He is a Christian sociologist and assistant professor of sociology at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. And we're discussing the trend of increased public demonstrations of anger in our society. Dr. Davignon, this phenomenon is not unique to the 21st century. Didn't we see the same kinds of demonstrations of outrage in the countercultural movement of the 1960s and early 70s?
Certainly, and I would say I think about two prominent examples being the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests. And I think that in many ways the anger and the outrage is similar, and yet it's also different. I think about how even though there were some people who wanted to use anger and violence in those movements, I think overall they were more focused on trying to find a peaceful solution, especially when it comes to nonviolence in the civil rights movement. And it seemed like people were more informed, that they knew more about the issues, and that the rhetoric and the language around what was being said around these issues wasn't quite as inflammatory overall. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, but it seems like overall it was a more balanced debate. And I think about the witness of Martin Luther King Jr. and how he wisely determined that nonviolence is a win-win scenario when it comes to trying to advocate for civil rights. And if people turn to anger and violence, even if they gain certain victories in the political world, it's just going to lead to resentment and more anger from the side who loses. And so there has to be a win-win solution. And I fear that when it comes to the differences that divide our country, we've forgotten his testimony, and each side is trying to use anger and violence to win, as opposed to seeking certain win-win solutions that I think typically are nonviolent and non-angry.
Good point. Do you think that this is just a cyclic phase that we're in, or do you think that instances of outrage and anger will continue to increase?
I think to some degree it's cyclical. I think that based on historical moments or events that happen, sometimes you see rage going up and down, anger going up and down in culture. But I think one main way that it's different from the past is that people have found that rage and anger is very profitable. I'm especially thinking about people in the media, actually, that if you can get people to be angry and to be fearful, you can sell a lot more TV shows, and you can sell a lot more books and magazine articles, and you can make a lot of money off of it. And so I think a lot of people, instead of trying to present a balanced view and a fair view, what they found is that there's much more money to be made in taking a much more one-sided and polarizing view. And I think that that's very bad for unity in our country, and it's very bad for democracy.
One of the things that concerns me with this present climate, especially as it pertains to social issues and politics, is that an increasing number of Christians appear to be influenced by it. What I mean is that as I talk with some believers, it seems that they think that it's okay to allow anger to be a determining factor in how we view and value individuals who don't hold to our principles. Why is that a problem?
Well, I think it's a problem because it's trying to focus primarily on other people, not ourselves. I think that if we look at the things that we do have, all the freedoms that we enjoy, all the benefits that we enjoy, I think that it leads to gratitude. But then also I think if we see the sin in other people's lives, then we're not able to see our own sin. We're not able to see the ways that we even contribute to this. And so it kind of reminds me actually of a quote by someone named Teresa of Avila who said, "Let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you. God never changes. Whoever has God lacks nothing." And I think about how if we're so focused on other people and how what they are doing is not allowing our life to be optimal, then we forget what our true foundation is, and we think that it's political process and changing society that makes our life good and makes the world good, and not a foundation in something deeper.
That's a good point. Mm-hmm. That Second Time article that I referred to, which, by the way, is titled "America's Anger is Out of Control," it shared an interesting quote, and I found it somewhat disturbing. You referred to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. earlier. Well, this is what he said, quote, "If I wish to compose or write or pray or preach well, I must be angry. Then all the blood in my veins is stirred and my understanding is sharpened." As we as Christians think about our role as salt and light in society, what does it do to our core message if we're seeking to achieve societal change while expressing our concerns in anger?
That's such an interesting quote. I think about how even in some cases, perhaps there is a righteous anger. And I think what distinguishes that from the anger that we seem to be opposed to is that we can have righteous anger towards injustice in society and in culture, but we shouldn't have anger against people. That we should always seek to love people and balance our righteous anger against the injustices in society and temper that with love toward people. And so it reminds me also of Romans chapter 12 that talks about, well, actually it says here, "Never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine.' To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And so I do think that anger is incredibly powerful, and I think the only thing that is more powerful than anger is love.
Wow. Now, there's something that we seem to have forgotten as Christians, at least in some segments of our Christian movement today, that love is even more powerful than anger. A good reminder. Well, Dr. Davington, we're just about out of time, but as we wrap up today, what would you like our listeners to take away from this discussion that they can apply to their everyday perceptions and how they function in our society today?
Well, we certainly live in times of anger and polarization, and I think what we can all do is to look at our own lives and to ask ourselves, are we perpetuating this anger in our conversations with friends and family and coworkers, and even what we write online? And are we witnessing to that truth of our faith that love is stronger than anger? And I think there is a real temptation to lower ourselves to what our current cultural standard is, which is falling victim to anger, but we need to remind ourselves of the stronger power of love.
Amen. That's a good word. And Dr. Davington, I thank you again for joining us today, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to address this very disturbing trend that we see in society.
Thank you, Vic.
That's our broadcast, and we invite you to join us again next week when we will address yet another topic of interest to the Christian community here on Weekend Connection on the Bible Broadcasting Network.
thank you for listening to this feature, a production of BBN, the Bible Broadcasting Network. BBN provides 24-hour Christian programming, great Christian music, and Bible teaching. Listen to BBN by clicking the link in the description.